Good afternoon to those in Australia and good morning to those in Afghanistan. My name is Ryan Attard and I am the president of the Monash International Affairs Society, and I'd like to welcome you all today to the second round of the Afghan-Australian Intercollegiate Debate. Before handing over to our chair, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land on which we hold today's debate, and we pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd now like to hand over to today's chair to commence our proceedings.
Thank you very much, Ryan, Jackie, Monash University team for providing this opportunity. Thank you very much, Afghans for Progressive Thinking organization for cooperating, and we are delighted to have Ms. Sarah Damel, the Senior Civil Representative in Afghanistan and the Political Advisor for this round of the debate will be Mr. Paul Fowey, the Afghan for Progressive Thinking organization. In the second step, Jackie will brief us all about Monash University, and then after that we will go to the round of the debate. From our side, Afghans for Progressive Thinking organization. It's an organization which was established in 2010 with a vision of a peaceful Afghanistan, and this nonprofit organization with the belief that youth as today's leader of Afghanistan can change the current situation in the country and can build a just and inclusive society for all. APT initially used two very basic theories of change to achieve its vision. These two theories are linking and the theory of contact. The areas that APT has worked in the past 10 years are, the first one is like capacity building through debates and leadership development programs. The second one is research and advocacy through publications, conferences, media shows. The third one is networking through exposure trips within Afghanistan and abroad. There are many programs APT undertakes to achieve its vision. The first one is debate, the second one is leadership, and the third one is radio programs and exposure international trips. We have achieved a lot within the last years. Major achievements of the last years could be advocacy for the resolution 2250 of the United Nations Security Council, which was drafted over the youth, peace and security. The second one was initiation of the annual youth representative to the United Nations to represent Afghan youth in an international stage, training over 30,000 youth and university students in debate and critical thinking, the establishment of an elementary school for 60 kids, and organizing the first international youth jirga, which brought together youth from across the country to discuss the Afghan peace process and the post-war Afghanistan. Now, I would like to call upon Jackie to brief us about Monash University.
Thanks very much, Zia. I really appreciate that introduction from APT. Monash University is really happy to collaborate with APT on the series of intercollegiate debates between Australian and Afghan youth. And in particular, I'm speaking as the director of the Monash Gender, Peace and Security Centre. At the Monash GPS, we aim to promote dialogue and integrate gender perspectives into peace and security policies, both in Australia, our region, and also globally. And like APT, we're really dedicated to supporting the implementation of both the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the Youth, Peace and Security agenda. We're very pleased to support the second round of these Afghan, intra-Afghan peace talk debates. today focused on the humanitarian ceasefire in light of our current situation of COVID. And I would just say that we are supporting these debates specifically with a focus on inclusive peace and on how to bring in and address the role of women, of human rights and equality in those intra-Afghan peace talks. So thank you very much to APT for the collaboration on this, which is in part inspired by some of your Afghan leaders.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for the brief about the judge of the round, Mr. Paul from...
We're lucky to have Mr. Paul Foley adjudicate today's debate. He is the Australian ambassador for counterterrorism. Mr. Foley is a senior career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and most recently served as ambassador to Iran. He's also served as ambassador to Afghanistan and Timor-Leste. In Canberra, he has led counterterrorism, Middle East and Africa, and information management branches. He is a graduate of Monash University, receiving a Bachelor of Economics, and has a graduate diploma in strategic studies from the Joint Services Staff College. In June 2013, he received the Public Service Medal for his role as ambassador to Afghanistan. So thank you so much, Mr. Foley, for adjudicating today's debate. We really appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy the debate between the Afghan and the Australian debaters. And now I will hand back to Ahmed Zia, our chair, to introduce the topic and the debaters.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you, Mr. Paul, for judging this round of the debate. Now, I would like to brief you all about the topic of the debate, and then I'll introduce the teams, both the government side and the opposition side. The motion for this round of the debate will be introduced later. First, I would like to take the courage to introduce to the debaters. We have two sides. We have the government sides. In government side, we have the opening government, Nisar Ahmad. Anwari, Mr. Kashifi, and Inafi. In opposition, Slivik, and we have Hema Hossain, and we have James Hajantanyo. The motion for this round of the debate is: this House believes that the Afghan government and Taliban should agree to an immediate and humanitarian ceasefire in light of COVID-19 pandemic. To notify the debaters once again, the speech will be a speech of 5 minutes. Each debater will have a 5-minute speech to deliver. And now, may I call upon the judge, Mr. Paul, to judge this round of the debate, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Nisar Ahmad Anwari, to deliver his 5-minute speech.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for the introduction. A country which is suffering from decades of war, political turmoil, extreme poverty, and a very poor healthcare system. The COVID-19 pandemic obviously imposed powerful impacts on the well-being of society and threatened the life of hundreds of thousands of people in Afghanistan. And actually, it's a challenge for the social, political, and economic stability of my country. Unfortunately, Afghanistan remains a country in conflict even in the midst of the COVID-19 global pandemic. Most recently, there have been widespread calls from across the globe, including the United Nations, the European Union, and some other regional partners and humanitarian organizations for a humanitarian ceasefire as the country battles a novel coronavirus. Yet these calls have been complicated by political uncertainty, delays in the sort of peace negotiations, and also it caused an increase in violences during the past several days. The first positive case was recorded in Afghanistan in month of February in Herat province. Within the 2 months, the positive cases surged about 2,896 positive cases in 90 days. This is the only data recorded officially and registered by the Minister of Public Health from 6 laboratories throughout the country. While the data is much more different, the real data is much more different than what the Minister of Public Health shared with the people. This data is only recorded from the people who are likely to test themselves and the people who are actually registered themselves as infected people of the coronavirus. Based on the interview of the Dr. Javed Hashmi, who is in charge of COVID-19 emergency case in Afghanistan, as an official data, there has been more than 15,000 of coronavirus positive cases only in Kabul city, and that is more than 200,000 in whole country. But the governmental body is lacking the facilities to test the people or to register the infected cases. On the other hand, lockdown in major cities reduce or reduction in in-person exports of the country, especially in the poor society of Afghanistan, has negative impacts. The country mostly relies on imports, and majority of the people working on daily paid basis. Lockdown and increase in unemployment rate is in the country increased poverty, and it makes difficult to have access for food. The main discussion in this debate is that does the government of Afghanistan has the ability to deal with both pandemic and Taliban at the same time? Considering the explanation that I provided, the fragile state of Afghanistan government cannot manage fight against the Taliban and COVID-19 at the same time. In light of this, we strongly believe that the government of Afghanistan and Taliban, or the Islamic fundamentalist political organization or the political movement, which is currently waging war and insurgency in Afghanistan, both should agree to an immediate humanitarian ceasefire until the mitigation and control of COVID-19 in Afghanistan. By humanitarian ceasefire, we mean a ceasefire which is agreed by both sides of the conflict to allow provision of health and humanitarian assistance, such as immunization campaigns and food supplies. It is actually the time to put armed conflict on that lockdown and focus together on the true fight of our lives. And the fight against mutual enemy, which does not care about the ethnicity, nationality, faction, or faith. It actually attacked all of us relentlessly. I would like to shed light on economic and healthcare, as well as the social perspectives of COVID-19 and the immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Afghanistan. The first argument is it's widely believed that COVID-19 put irreversible impacts on global economy. Afghanistan, as a developing country, a country that mostly relies on international aid, is the main victim of the COVID-19. And the COVID-19 spread in Afghanistan when the USA has decided to cut down around 1 billion of its aid. Unfortunately, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world, and the poverty in Afghanistan is widespread in 41% of the country. The pandemic increased the poverty in Afghanistan. That's the reason that we will have to take care of our nation and our people in order to deal with the mutual
Thank you very much, debater. It was quite a good speech and good arguments. Now we may call upon the opposition leader, Ms. Mena Basrevic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It goes without saying how honoured I am to have the opportunity to speak in this debate. Mr. Speaker, the basic thesis of our stance is very simple. Wherever there is violence, there is unresolved conflict. Unresolved conflict means that there is an incompatibility of goals and of means that has not been superseded or has not been resolved. To momentarily remove the violence in Afghanistan does not resolve the conflict. That is to say that in the face of a new invisible enemy that wreaks its havoc across not only Afghanistan's cities and regions, but the country and the world, securing the safety of the population and continued peace processes will not be achieved with a fleeting and hastily arrived at ceasefire, as our opponents are suggesting. Mr. Speaker, there are 2 points that I will be addressing as part of my substantive argument. However, before I share these points, I would like to preface that each rests on an unwavering focus to achieve long-term peace in Afghanistan while ensuring the safety of citizens during this pandemic. The first point I will be addressing is that a humanitarian ceasefire is unfeasible. And secondly, that there are indeed alternative solutions at our disposal that would more effectively address both COVID-19 and long-term peace. Turning to our first issue, our opposition has clung to the proposition that there is a precedent to suggest a ceasefire can be achieved. However, may I remind the House that we are in another world with a new enemy that has introduced an unprecedented complexity in the conflict. Yet, even if we indulge the opposition's argument that a ceasefire is an appropriate solution, we arrive at 2 issues. The first and most obvious is that there is currently no indication from the Taliban that they would accept such a ceasefire. As we are all well aware, this is a group that has used terrorism as the main source for making themselves relevant, a group which quintessentially rejects humanitarian principles, and a group which, for these grueling years of war, has shown little indication of compassion in times of emergency and hardship. The presence of COVID-19 has not, and likely will not, change their stance. The second issue is that a ceasefire poses a high risk to trust between conflicting parties. As I will return to, a breach of the ceasefire, which is more common than not, has the potential to severely undermine the viability of future peace efforts. Let us not put the cart before the horse. We cannot trust or race to a ceasefire before we've attained trust. But beyond this, a ceasefire is not pragmatically achievable in the given timeframe. An effective ceasefire agreement must encapsulate features such as what constitutes a ceasefire violation, monitoring mechanisms, incident verification, dispute settlement tools, and the list goes on and on. The urgency of the situation diminishes any liberty of time to arrive at such a comprehensive agreement. To arrive at anything less would be to risk disintegrating the already tenuous trust. This brings me to my next point, and that is while a ceasefire may run counter to Afghanistan's goals, alternatives exist that could bring about more effective short-term solutions while not obstructing the long-term peace processes. Our proposition is to seek a reduction of violence, or what I'll refer to as RIV. So why an RIV and not a ceasefire? The answer to this question lies in appreciating the context in which such an agreement takes place. For one, an RIV allows for what a ceasefire does not, a margin of error. The Taliban is a large, multi-dimensional organization, and Afghanistan itself is a large, complex place. It is unfeasible to expect a complete halt of bullets being fired. A margin of error is important not only because of the complexity of the Taliban, but also because neither side wants to bind their hands and look as though they are compromising their position. We know that this approach is to be preferred. In fact, a 7-day RIV occurred during the signing of the Doha Agreement. While during this time, there were some instances of Taliban violence in parts of the country, even the Afghan Defense Ministry indicated not to judge the truth by that. It is possible that the orders didn't get through. It is possible that there were misunderstandings, but on the whole, it was recognized as reasonable success. On the contrary, if a ceasefire were to take place without this fundamental margin of error, a breach of its conditions would be catastrophic to the long-term goals of both parties. Mr. Speaker, I started my speech with the notion that wherever there is violence, there is unresolved conflict. Our position recognizes the gravity that COVID-19 presents to Afghanistan. However, while we attempt to reduce the violence during this time, we cannot lose sight of the long-term goal of addressing the root of the conflict and achieving long-lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naima, for the good speech. Now we may call upon Mohammad Azim Kashfi as the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver his 5-minute speech. Are we ready, Mr. Azim?
By the permission of their colleagues and their judges, the opposition leader came into 2 points and saying that we accept that it is a pandemic and it affects everyone. It doesn't accept any border and it doesn't accept anyone. So like if you're a president, if you're just a public person, it doesn't matter for this pandemic. And this is an emergency. This is a need for an emergency that we have to have control this COVID-19 because it is affecting everyone. But at the end of the story, she asked us that we should just reduce the violence, and that's an alternative. And with that, we can control the COVID-19. But we, as a humanitarian organization, which we are representing WHO, we are asking the both parties. I know that they don't have any trust. I know that they don't have. They don't want to. They don't want to like bring. At this moment, like urgently, they bring peace. So they are just fighting with each other because they have differences in their values and differences in what Afghanistan government is doing and what they are doing. So they are like saying we are implementing Sharia law, and the government of Afghanistan is just saying we are doing the same. We also do democracy and the Sharia law. So they have differences in the values. So what we need for the current moment, because the pandemic doesn't understand that if you're like a Talib person or if you're under the government side of Afghanistan. Recently, the spokesperson of Taliban said that we have differences, so that's why we fight, and we don't accept ceasefire from the government because we don't accept them. They are the government of Afghanistan. They give the name or a nickname for the government side as the administration of Kabul instead of Afghanistan government. So we have this. There is a problem. They don't have trust, and they don't want to. To have peace deals at the moment. But we are coming as a perspective of controlling and mitigating the COVID-19, which doesn't know the border and doesn't know who you are. And it affects everybody and it kills everybody. So what we need to do is at this moment to mitigate this and control the pandemic, because it is daily increasing around the world. The country, the most like economically a country which has a lot of money and a lot of resources is the United States, but currently they are struggling fighting this pandemic. So Afghanistan, a poor country, it doesn't have any money, it doesn't have any resources, it doesn't have any financial aspects, as according to the Prime Minister, which clearly defined we are a poor country. Afghanistan is a poor country and there is a poverty. Above 60% of Afghanistan are living in poverty area. And we need to control it. So the only thing is that we need to have financial aid. For this pandemic, Afghanistan received only $500 million, which is not acceptable. But the war in Afghanistan daily, like for annually, like for 2019, it was $52 billion that is spent on the war of Afghanistan. So if this comes to the health system and we can have these resources for the health, so definitely we can control it. So that's why we are affirming and we are asking for both parties that they have to have a humanitarian ceasefire at this moment. Considering the financial aspects, we are also saying what's the health system in Afghanistan. At this moment, Ministry of Public Health is the only official organization that's provide healthcare system for the Afghanistan. But Taliban doesn't have any such system. So if there is nothing like that, and this is statistic that is said by the Prime Minister, which is there is only 3,000, like 3,000 people is infected in Afghanistan. So it is not a real statistic, because under the areas that there are Taliban, there is plenty of infected people and we don't have any data and nobody recognized them. So that's why we are asking for the both parties that they should have ceasefire at this moment and use this time and the social aspect. As a social aspect, this time that the ceasefire that is for the pandemic will be used to deal with the differences that they have. Like, this is the social impact of this ceasefire. They can talk with each other. They can find their trust. So this will, the ceasefire that we are asking will have advantage financially, advantage on health system, because we will be like greatly, there will be resources that we can control this pandemic. And additionally, it will have a social impact because people will be possible to talk each other and trust each other, and there will be a peace, a long-term peace and a sustainable peace for Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, debater, for the outstanding speech. Now we may call upon the Deputy Opposition Leader, Francisco Barres.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Speaker. We, the opposition, submit that the government's immediate ceasefire suggestion poses numerous risks to peace and the ability to combat COVID-19 in Afghanistan, which stands in contrast to our more holistic and practical policy alternative. Now, with all due respect to the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister's assertions that a ceasefire is required to provide healthcare and immunisation and also deal with the lack of trust between the government and the Taliban, we would like to submit that this actually isn't the case, and there are alternatives that achieve both those things that currently exist without a ceasefire. Mr. Speaker, we contend that evidence should precede decisions rather than decisions precede evidence. And the evidence is clear. Similar COVID-related ceasefires in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, the Philippines and Libya have all failed. The Taliban has a poor track record when it comes to negotiating long-term ceasefires, with the longest they've ever been able to muster being 7 days. And ever since March, the Taliban has actually ratcheted up violence in the country, actually surpassing seasonal norms and causing more murders than last year. Given these circumstances, how possibly can this government assume that a successful ceasefire can be achieved? Because in doing so, they fail to consider the harsh reality that even in the midst of a great public health threat, the Taliban is not interested in a ceasefire. An immediate ceasefire also risks worsening the already poor levels of trust between the government and the Taliban, when now, more than ever, trust is required to combat our common enemy, the coronavirus. Mr. Speaker, the challenge we face is complex in nature and deserves a multifaceted and holistic solution, which I'm pleased that the Deputy Prime Minister actually agreed is the case. But our proposals achieve just that. We seek inter-party trust initiatives to ensure the delivery of equal medical treatment across Afghanistan, and also the implementation of regional border controls and an international monitoring and support framework to support Afghanistan's COVID-19 response. Now, it is clear that the Taliban will not work with the government in the absence of trust, and pushing for an immediate ceasefire will not only fall on deaf ears, but it loses precious time needed to ensure lives are not lost. Therefore, an RIV, as outlined by the opposition leader so comprehensively, is far more practical. It also allows the government to focus on providing uniform healthcare to all provinces in Afghanistan, for which cooperation with the Taliban is essential, whether we like it or not. Now, we should learn from the district platforms for dialogue model adopted against the fight for against Ebola in West Africa, as it facilitated cooperation between conflicting government and insurgency forces, not only ensuring compliance with government-related health directives, but also improving long-term trust between warring groups that was bettering long-term peace and stability. Further, the WHO already has access to Taliban-controlled areas. So if the government already has the means to respond to the pandemic by working with the Taliban, why pursue an idealistic ceasefire that risks undermining access to these areas? Preventing the horrific ramifications of the coronavirus is the goal. Strengthening inter-party trust is the only way to ensure we achieve it. Now, Mr. Speaker, the government must also consider the bigger picture. A major component of this is securing Afghanistan's porous borders, specifically that with Iran. Currently, over 90,000 immigrants have entered from Iran alone without receiving sufficient testing. And it is no surprise, therefore, that Afghanistan's Herat region is one of the highest and worst affected rates, it's one of the worst affected regions in Afghanistan with one of the highest rates of COVID-19. Herat highlights the threat posed by returning citizens and the impetus to cooperate with regional neighbours to ensure cross-border movements are properly managed. This is yet another area where trust and cooperation with the Taliban is essential. Pursuing a ceasefire will only sabotage these efforts. Now, these regional border controls will also be bolstered by international monitoring and coordination frameworks, which have been successful in the past, as witnessed with Indonesia ending 3 decades of violence with the Free Aceh movement, and also mitigating conflict in West Africa. So we submit that a similar model to that of the Ebola UN mission be adopted, because it was so effective even in the absence of a ceasefire. And it can also be realistic and achievable because China, America, and Russia have stated their intentions to support such an initiative. In summation, Afghanistan's numerous vulnerabilities make it likely that the country will confront a disaster. The only way we can prevent it is to pursue the policies that we are putting forward, which will ultimately save lives and hopefully this great nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco. That was such a nice debate. Now, I would like to call upon the member of the government, Ms. Hasina Wardak, to extend the debate.
So I'm going to start my debate by rebutting Ms. Paris. At the very beginning, he came and talked about the long-term peace, and he believed that if there is like no ceasefire, there will be long-term peace. And so now I have my, I'm going to like rebut him by citing the Mr. Alexander Ramsbottom. He believed that in order to have long-term peace, there should be some steps to follow. The very beginning is to have a ceasefire. Now, it is the fundamental part for the long-term peace. And the second step is to have a committee in which both parties could talk to each other and share the issues, political issues together. The third thing is to launch a dialogue between each other. And the last thing is to build a friendly relationship with each other. Then he further mentioned that in order to have a long-term peace, the base should be always there. If you don't have the base, there is no long-term peace for Afghanistan. Now, it is like building a house. Now, in order to build a house, there should be a basement. Now, if we don't have the basement, how are we supposed to build the other pillars of the building? So the same goes with the peace. Now, in order to have a long-term peace, we need to have the ceasefire, which is the first step, and then go for the next step in the other parts. Now, why would we believe the ceasefire is going to help us to have long-term peace? Now, because at the very beginning, it is believed that in order to have, whenever we are having ceasefires, it means we are bonding a friendly relationship with each other. Now, when we're having a friendly relationship, we can go and have the long-term peace, and we are going to trust each other. But if there is no trust, the long-term peace will be like no more there. There will be a short-term peace, and no one is like going to go for the short-term peace, because like we have already had these short-term which didn't work. And the second thing that he talked about was the immigrants, like mainly the Iranian immigrants which came to Afghanistan, and they were not tested. Yeah, we do. I do agree that we have like so many immigrants from Iran that they are not like tested, and we are having we are having it in Afghanistan. Like, so what is the problem with this one? So I'm gonna rebut him by saying that because we are having like Afghanistan is a country which has like it doesn't have really good budgets. So the main focus of the Afghanistan is right now on the peace negotiation things. They're not really concerned with this pandemic. So because like they are more into these negotiation things, they're not really having this. They are not allocating their budgets to the pandemic. So that's why like we are having a lot of these cases right now. And that's it. Now, so coming to my first argument is that ceasefire will help the government to handle the urgent things at the very beginning. So now, what are the urgent things? The urgent things is the life of the people. Now, as you can see that a lot of cases are here in Afghanistan right now. It was because like we don't have a specific, let us say, budget for it. So that's why we are mainly focusing on the negotiation things. And the second thing is to fight with poverty and to fight with the people, let us say, in Afghanistan, peoples are not even following the social distancing. They are like, when you go and see the street, there are like 1,000 Afghan that they are like going. So if you ask them, they are asking for food. They are not really into this pandemic disease. They believe that if we are in our homes, nobody is going to feed us and we're going to die because of the poverty. So that's why the very basic things are like, if we have the ceasefire, so the government can focus on the people in the poverty and also on the pandemic disease, and they can allocate the budgets on these important things. Now, so the other thing is like ceasefire will help. My third argument is that ceasefire will help the public. The health employees. Now, what is the problem with the Taliban? We're having like more than 1,200 attacks after 2009 till now. And mainly the health employees, they cannot go to the suburbans because Taliban like are having a lot of power on the suburbans areas. So in order to have control over that areas, in order to train people that how to fight with this pandemic disease, they need to go there and train them, but they are not capable to go there. Why? Because like we're having the Talibans over there. So in order to have control over, like in order to train people how to fight with these things, so it is needed to be like everybody there should be a health sector to go there and train the people. In this way, if the Talibans and the government work together, they can have the
now we may call upon the member of the opposition side, Homa Hussain, to deliver her 5-minute speech.
The government has previously discussed the pressing need to address the impacts of COVID-19 given the budgetary constraints and the ongoing poverty in Afghanistan. However, we would like to reiterate that our stance remains clear. A ceasefire is not the best possible course of action to ensure both long-lasting peace and the safety of the population. The premise of this argument is on the basis that a ceasefire is an unsustainable and short-term approach to the issues currently facing Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, I would like to raise 2 key points in addressing this argument, but before going to these points, I would like to note that they rest on the clear distinction between addressing COVID-19 and ensuring a successful peace process, and it would be unwise to conflate the 2 issues at hand. My 2 arguments are as follows. Firstly, an immediate ceasefire will hinder and delay the achievement of a long-term peace process. And secondly, that addressing COVID-19 would be better found focusing on building trust and awareness of the issue. Although it has been raised by the member of the government that a ceasefire is the base which opens the floor to facilitate efforts ensuring peace and safety, I would like to remind the House that such an argument is conditional. As the Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition have previously mentioned, in its current circumstances, Afghanistan does not have the necessary conditions to facilitate a successful and immediate ceasefire. I remind the House of the lack of willingness, the lack of trust, and the lack of enforcement mechanisms that are currently present. Mr. Speaker, this makes any consideration for a ceasefire, for peace, or for humanitarian safety flawed. And to drive efforts and attentions to a ceasefire that would be flawed is a mistake that we cannot afford. Under a context of unwillingness and stalemate within current negotiations, it would be foolish to think that these same barriers would not be occurring during a negotiation of a ceasefire. This shift to create a ceasefire would derail the perceived achievements of the current peace process held by parties. And not only would this damage an already tense relationship between parties, it would also discourage parties to work together for the more desirable goal of negotiating a long-term peace process. While one might argue that on the balance of things, the time it takes to create a peace process would be longer than outlining a ceasefire, I would like to raise an additional point that stems from the fact that the US Taliban deal, reduction of violence, has an end goal to reach a full ceasefire. For the Taliban, the ceasefire is actually one of the final steps in negotiating a peace process. It is not the base that the member of the government mentions. As such, not only would it be unlikely that the Taliban will accept concessions on the rest of the deal, a ceasefire can also act as a false sense of achievement. And it is irresponsible to jump to what is considered as one of the end goals without acting on the other issues concerning the parties. This shift to a ceasefire would only exacerbate existing issues that are present in the peace process and reduce its potential for success. This also brings me to my next point. Similarly, relying on a ceasefire to address the current public health crisis is again flawed due to its basis stemming from a conditional and hypothetical success of this ceasefire. Mr. Speaker, we propose that addressing COVID-19 in Afghanistan relies rather on trust between all parties and greater awareness and education of the issue. The House must remember that this is a country that has been in turmoil for the past 20 years, where there exists already a breakdown of communication and a breakdown of trust. It would be bold to assume that these differences and a health crisis can be bridged by a simple ceasefire. We agree that there are different elements within the health and social factors that are needed to be improved for COVID-19 to be curbed. But given that it is unlikely that a ceasefire would be successful, a more sustainable approach would be to involve means that reignite the trust between parties. We still believe that working together with the existing efforts the Taliban has implemented, such as enforcing quarantine, social distancing, and provide testing and PPE, is one way that the government can do this. It is imperative that the Afghanistan government recognizes these efforts and cooperate together, rather than antagonize them in order to bolster the country's capabilities to deliver proper healthcare services and directives. The government also needs to involve religious leaders to play a greater role in raising public health awareness. Acting as supplementary to each other's existing efforts would prove more effective in mitigating the impacts of COVID. Mr. Speaker, the opposition remains certain that the alternative of a reduction of violence would not hinder long-term solutions such as the peace process and ensure that COVID-19 can adequately be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for this speech. Now we may call upon the last member, not the least member of the government side, Dawood Safi, to wrap up the debate.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very factually incorrect debate from the side of opposition. First off, a few things. Opening opposition's whole case revolves around 2 points. One, can we build trust? And two, is it a tested approach? Which one is a tested approach and which can generate success in the long term? And for the second team, for the closing off, they give us just 1 point, that a ceasefire would hurt the long-term peace efforts. Mr. Speaker, firstly, the factual incorrections. Opening opposition tells us that there was a 7-day RIV after the Doha talks with the US, which was successful. That is completely incorrect. There was a RIV agreed upon, which has failed miserably, Mr. Speaker, which in turns in itself opposes the idea of side opposition that RIV could work. Secondly, they tell us that WHO, their whole approach is based on WHO and UN agencies being able to have access to the Taliban area and helping the people that are living in the Taliban area because there's a lack of trust between the government and Taliban. But Mr. Speaker, WHO, UNICEF, and other health agencies have been banned from Taliban area for the last 2 years. Most of these agencies, after what happened to bin Laden, who was killed in Pakistan, and because the spy was a polio worker, they have banned all these agencies to work under their areas. So the model they're proposing is not feasible and it's not going to work. Mr. Speaker, whoever answers these questions wins today's debate. First, is the approach that they're proposing, is it a tested approach? And secondly, which one solves the issue in the long term? Mr. Speaker, the RIV which they're proposing has been in effect in Afghanistan since the Taliban-US talks concluded in Doha months ago. Mr. Speaker, it was agreed upon 80% of RIV, but here are the problems. One, how do you measure RIV? How do you measure that there has been less violence and not more, because there's not a specific framework for you to measure that? What is not a lot of people killed? 2,000 people, is it less, is it more? What is your approach of measuring that RIV? And secondly, Mrs. Speaker, because Taliban is a very fractured movement, and people work in very local areas, it is impossible to impose an RIV to them. And it is impossible for the Taliban leadership to explain the level of reduction in violence that every field commander has to undertake. Okay, these are illiterate people. They are the people who only know how to fight. They don't know how to measure, okay, reduce violence by 80%. So that is why the RIV is not feasible. But also, Mr. Speaker, why is a ceasefire a tested approach? Last year, at the end of Ramadan, Afghanistan and Taliban agreed on a 3-day truce, a ceasefire, complete ceasefire. Mr. Speaker, in 3 days of Eid, not a single bullet was fired, and that was the success. Mr. Speaker, that was the precedent. That was where the trust was built. That is why Taliban and Afghanistan, the Afghan government, took the next step and went towards the Afghan talks and towards the peace talk. Because before this ceasefire, everybody thought that a ceasefire is impossible and the only solution is fighting. But that ceasefire proved that no, we could have a ceasefire, so it led to both sides engaging in talks. That is one. Is it a tested approach? Yes, it has been tested before. It could work now. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, why is our model more feasible? One, because the morality aspects of it, as my member of the government touched upon it. For Taliban to stop violence, it has to have an ideological backing to it. They cannot stop fighting unless it's justified to them ideologically. Why did they stop fighting during the Eid days? Because it's an ideologically, Islamically accepted idea to not fight during the days of when everybody is celebrating. So it was easy to motivate them to start, to agree to a peace talk. That is one. Secondly, it's more feasible to have a ceasefire than to have an RIV, because RIV, there are local commanders and it's not feasible. You cannot actually implement RIV, while ceasefire is easily trackable. If anybody attacks it, you can easily report it. Mr. Speaker, from our side, we have proven to you two things. One, ceasefire is a tested approach in the Afghan context, and it has happened before and it's been successful. RIV has been happening. It's still today, to this day, RIV is on, but the violence has scaled up, and there's more violence as the opposition leader agreed to it. Secondly, our model solves the problem not just in the short term, but also in the long term, because it builds trust. It has happened before. If ceasefire is possible, it would work towards a long-term peace and help both sides to engage in the peace talks. For these reasons, I beg to propose the motion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dawood, for the speech. Now we may call upon the last but not the least member of the government side, Sir James Hadiji Antonio.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As explained by the Prime Minister, it is immensely difficult for Afghanistan to fight COVID and the Taliban. Unfortunately, this does not change the fact that the government does not have the necessary frameworks to facilitate an immediate ceasefire. The government has failed to turn their minds to the adverse consequences inextricably linked to such a hasty decision. The fundamental issue is that the government's argument is based on a series of unsubstantiated presumptions. Even if these presumptions were true, it does not follow that a ceasefire would deliver peace. Presumption number one, the Taliban will agree to a ceasefire. As outlined by the deputy leader of the opposition, Afghanistan's history reflects an anti-ceasefire sentiment. We wish to remind the government whip that citing a 3-day ceasefire is of little use to the present debate. COVID cannot be beaten in 3 days, and such a precedent is no longer relevant. History aside, the virus affects Afghanistan government more than it affects the Taliban. The Taliban would only sacrifice this advantage if the ceasefire agreement greatly favoured their interests. Therefore, an immediate ceasefire comes at the cost of the Afghanistan government's long-term interests. The motivation for the Taliban withholding agreement on the ceasefire until the prisoner exchange reflects this premise. The exchange of 1,000 pro-government captives for 5,000 Taliban prisoners proportionately enlarges the Taliban's standing army. Presumption number two, there is no assurance the Taliban will adhere to the ceasefire. As the member of the government said, and I must confess I do agree, a house must have solid foundations. The success of a ceasefire is contingent upon trust. Imposing an immediate ceasefire without first developing the requisite level of trust would be like building the first floor prior to completing the basement. the entire structure is destined to collapse, leading us into presumption number 3. The whip was very quick to point out the issues in monitoring and RIV, but they pale into comparison to the government's failure to provide an effective monitoring system of other insurgent groups in Afghanistan during the ceasefire. As explained by the opposition leader, requiring monitoring arrangements cannot be established on immediate timeline. They are immensely complex. Unfortunately, an improperly monitored ceasefire delivers a gift-wrapped opportunity to insurgent groups to carry out acts of violence under the guise of the Taliban. This will break the trust between the Afghan government and the Taliban, wasting all resources expending in implementing the ceasefire, and see the first floor crushing into the basement. Concluding on these premises, let's turn our attention to the fact the government has placed themselves at the finish line of the race to peace without first considering the steps it takes to get there. Instead, let us canvass once again the opposition members' far more realistic steps towards peace. As the leader of the opposition identified, the first component of our framework to combat COVID and promote peace is a reduction of violence agreement. In responding to the government whip, hypothetically, were we to accept your premise that it failed, which we do not, even if that was true, it does not justify the imposition of a ceasefire. If anything, a RIV is a watered-down version of a ceasefire targeting systematic areas, and therefore, if you believe a RIV fails, you should logically conclude that a ceasefire will not apply. But alas, that is not the case, and the RIV has demonstrated a great deal of success, and that is for 2 reasons in the present case. Number 1, it is likely that a reduction of violence agreement will be met, and number 2, as the leader of the opposition's explained, albeit in much more concrete terms, one bullet has the potential to cascade a ceasefire, but fortunately, a reduction in violence is not subject to this risk. As the deputy leader of the opposition explained, the second component of proposal is border control. The Iran border operates as a revolving door, allowing thousands of Afghans to cross the border without adequate screening procedures. This, alongside regional and international support, must be prioritised. Next, the deputy leader, a member of opposition, kindly explained the third component of our proposal. And answering the government whip, he who or she who canvasses a tested method, a part of our approach, as outlined by the deputy leader, is that our approach is tested in the Ebola crisis in West Africa, which presented very similar challenges. And taking your words, indeed, it would be foolish to ignore the successful models and frameworks that successfully resolved that crisis. Skipping to the conclusion, and apologies for the brevity, Mr. Speaker, in closing, we state, COVID cannot facilitate an immediate ceasefire. It is a virus, not a mediator, and implementing a ceasefire will undermine long-term peace. The opposition initiatives designed to minimise the effects of COVID that simultaneously bolsters the trust between the Afghanistan government and the Taliban. The increased trust from these initiatives, coupled with additional time, will allow the government to later implement a ceasefire that accounts for all complex issues canvassed today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. James. Thank you, everyone for the good debate. The arguments were quite essential for the situation of Afghanistan. We will later coalesce the arguments and we'll share it with the organizations who are working to bring about peace in Afghanistan. Thank you very much. Now we call upon Mr. Paul to provide feedbacks for the debaters. Before that, I would like to hand over the microphone to Mr. Ryan if he has anything to say.
Thank you, Ahmed Zia. And thank you so much to all the debaters, and congratulations, you all did a fantastic job. We look forward to looking at your arguments again and taking back those ideas and seeing how they may influence policy. Before we move on to hearing feedback from our adjudicator, we will have a short 5-minute break in which you can all have a little rest, but we can also allow our adjudicator to summarize his feedback and decide who is the best speaker and the runner-up. We will recommence at 4:05 Melbourne time, which is 10:35 Kabul time. We'll now move back into the formal aspect of the debate, and We will now go to our adjudicator, Mr. Paul Foley, Australian Ambassador for Counterterrorism, who will give his own remarks on the topic and will also give you feedback and announce who the best speaker and the runner-up for the debate is.
Well, good morning. Salam to my Afghan friends. Ramadan Mubarak to you as well. And thank you, Ryan and Ahmed Zia. Can I say what a great pleasure it is for me to be asked to adjudicate this debate as someone who spent some years both in Afghanistan and at Monash, although my time in Afghanistan was more recent than my time at Monash, but I have a great fondness for both places and was delighted to be able to accept the invitation to adjudicate this debate. Can I congratulate Monash University and the Afghans for progressive thinking, for engaging in this very important debate? And can I firstly, in starting, just recognize and congratulate the Afghan side for debating very coherently and fluently in a second language. That's not an easy thing to do, and it's a thing which would defeat most Australians, including myself. So very well done on that. It's a very important topic that you chose to debate today. It contained many important issues: how to bring about peace in a country that's sadly been racked by more than 40 years of war and conflict, and how do we deal with the humanitarian issues surrounding a pandemic, and how do you deal with those issues when those two things happen at the same time. So not easy to do at all. Can I congratulate all of the speakers? I thought you were all fluent, urgent, passionate, and logical in your presentations. I thought the issues were traversed very well, very coherently. I think both sides had a strategy, and they stuck to it in setting out their views and then trying to rebut the other side. I think both grappled very effectively with the issue of how do you advance peace and address COVID. And of course, it's a so-called wicked problem. It's very difficult, very complex, and it came down to the government side urging a ceasefire, and the opposition proposing as an alternative, as good opposition should, a reduction in violence. Both sides, I think, recognise that neither is easy, neither is straightforward, and the arguments can sometimes very much be on the margins. Can I observe that for the government side, for the Afghan side, I was very impressed by your arguments. I thought they were grounded in the realities of Afghanistan, which you live every day, which you know the difficulties of 40 years of war and the state of development and the state of the health system. So you underlined the morality of seeking to address a ceasefire, and said that that is perhaps the most simple solution, although by no means completely simple. The opposition, as I said, like a good opposition, you came out with alternatives. I think the opposition drew, as I guess you'd expect, an international opposition to from some international examples, and perhaps came up with some proposals that were more complex than a ceasefire, such as a reduction in violence. As I sit here, I can't say which one is right, which one is more likely to succeed. Certainly, the difficult can be difficult to achieve, but sometimes the simple can be difficult to achieve too. And there is no more complex place, I think, in the world than Afghanistan. And it's been very difficult to deal with this issue and to try and see how a crisis can be leveraged. I think both sides were certainly motivated by the morality of the situation and the need to achieve good health outcomes, but also advance peace. It was very hard for me to separate the speakers. I thought you were all good, but separate them I must, and come up with a judgment on a runner-up and then the best speaker. So in terms of the runner-up, I judge that the runner-up speaker is Ms. Hannah Hossain from the Australian side. I thought her style was very passionate, assured, lively, and confident. But she also ran through all of the issues very systemically and very logically. She set out the best case that you could make for a comprehensive solution, leading to an RIV. So congratulations, Hannah. And the best speaker, I think, and I congratulate you, is the final Afghan speaker, Mr. Dawood Safi. That was a very good presentation, Dawood. You had a very strong logical framework. You reiterated the case for your side very well, and set out the criteria on which the sides should be judged. You were very assured, fluent, and logical, and I congratulate you on your speech. But can I just reiterate that it was very high quality debate from both sides. I think you grappled with a very difficult and very complex issue very strongly, and that's a testament to your wide reading and your teachers and your debate. So I congratulate you on that. Certainly, I don't know what the answer is, but you've certainly given me and all of us a lot of food for thought. So can I congratulate you all again, and wish you all the very best for the future, and particularly to friends in Afghanistan. Wish you and your country all the best for the future. That and finally there will be peace after 40 years, and that hopefully the country can avoid the humanitarian disaster that COVID threatens. So thank you everyone. Thank you Ahmed Zia. Thank you Jackie, and thank you Ryan for the the invitation to adjudicate this debate.
Thank you very much, Paul, for adjudicating this round of the debate. I would like to thank Monash University for the collaboration and making it to have such a round of debate. And I would like to thank Sarah Dimmel for joining us for this round of debate. And thanks to the debaters for offering very reasonable arguments and creating models for the crisis in Afghanistan. Thank you very much. It was a very enjoyable debate. Thanks to Mr. Dawood Safi and Omar Hassan for the positions. Now I would like to handle the stage to Ryan.
Thank you for that. And congratulations to Hammer and Dawood on being runner-up and best speaker for this debate. And congratulations to everyone on this debate. The arguments were excellent. And it is quite a difficult topic to discuss, especially as it is currently underway and we are living during this pandemic at the moment. Just before we do conclude the debate, we want to extend some thanks to the organisers. First of all, to Mr. Foley, thank you so much for adjudicating this debate, and we really appreciate it. To our friends at APT, to our chair, Ahmed Zia, thank you so much for the amazing work you've done in this debate. And also thank you to Ajmal for all his assistance as well in organising this second round, and to Bahara, who I don't believe is also on the call. From the Monash side, I would also like to thank Monash Gender, Peace and Security. Thanks goes to Professor Jackie True for organising this debate series, along with Sarah Phillips, who is the Program Officer at Monash GPS. And also just special thanks to those who assisted, Sitara Mohammadi, who made a video for our debaters who are here today, and also to Associate Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer at Griffith University, who also made a video. And we hope to work together soon. And thank you so much for all the hard work that you've put in. And I'll now hand back to Ahmed Zia to end the debate.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It was quite a good debate. Thanks to everybody. Not much has left. I think we should wrap up, and the debate officially ends here.